They called it the Zero Killer. But on that humid morning over the vast Pacific, none of us truly knew if the rumors were true. I was Lieutenant Mark Hawk Harris, United States Navy, and I was strapped into a machine so new, so secret, that even some of our own men hadn't laid eyes on it up close. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. She was not delicate, not graceful, not a ballerina of the skies. She was a fighter, big, heavy, and bristling with firepower. Nothing like the fragile Wildcats we had flown before. And today, she was going to prove herself in blood and fire. The year was 1943. For nearly 2 years, the Japanese Zero had ruled the skies. Fast, agile, deadly, flown by pilots who had been training since boyhood. Men who had mastered the art of aerial combat long before we had even seen our first carrier. The Zero was more than a plane. It was a symbol of Japanese dominance in the Pacific. And we were the prey. I'd seen friends go down in flames. Good men, brave men, wildcats turned into tumbling fireballs under the Zero's guns. Every mission felt like we were stepping into a loaded gun barrel, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. But then everything changed. Grumman delivered us something different. Something built not to match the Zero's grace, but to crush it with sheer strength and brutality. The Hellcat. I still remember standing on the deck of the USS Essex that morning, the salty wind whipping at my flight suit, the smell of oil and sea mixing in the air. The mechanics rolled her out into the sunlight. She looked alive. A predator with wide, predatory wings, a massive engine that seemed to growl even before it started, and 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, their barrels catching the morning light like teeth of a hunting beast. She wasn't built for beauty. She was built to kill. Our squadron commander, Commander Blake, stood there with his helmet under his arm, a grin spreading across his weathered face. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of tools clanking on steel. "Meet the Zero's worst nightmare." There were no cheers, no cocky laughter. We just stared at the Hellcat, each of us thinking the same thing. Maybe, just maybe, this will be the one that brings us home alive. It was still dark when we assembled in the briefing room, the single overhead bulb casting shadows across the maps pinned to the wall. The air was thick, not just with humidity, but with the unspoken knowledge that some of us wouldn't come back. On the wall, a large map of the Solomon Islands glared back at us, dotted with red and blue markings. A young intelligence officer stood in front, pointer in hand. "Reconnaissance from yesterday evening spotted a Japanese strike force here." He tapped the map near a cluster of tiny blue lines. "Heading southeast. Estimated 20 Mitsubishi Zeros escorting at least a dozen bombers. Target, one of our convoys." In the old days, that would have been suicide. Today it was a test. Commander Blake stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "Listen up. This isn't a chase. We're not here to outdance them. The Hellcat is a brawler. You meet them head on. Use your climb, use your dive, and when you've got the shot, you take it. No hesitation." "Understood." We answered in unison. "Yes, sir." He looked each of us in the eye, his tone hardening. "They've been running this show for too long. Let's show the Emperor's finest what happens when America decides to hit back." The deck was alive with motion when we stepped out, crewmen darting between aircraft, fueling lines hissing, the smell of aviation fuel mixing with the sea air. The horizon was just starting to glow with the first hints of sunrise. I climbed into the Hellcat's cockpit, the leather seat still cool against my flight suit. I ran my hand over the throttle, the stick, the instrument panel. Everything felt solid, like the plane was carved from steel itself. The Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine sat in front of me, a beast of a machine. When it started, the whole plane shuddered like a predator waking from a long sleep. Over the radio, Blake's voice crackled. "All right, boys, time to go hunting." One by one, our Hellcats roared down the deck, their tires lifting free of the carrier with a burst of ocean wind. The sea below was glassy, the clouds above streaked with crimson from the rising sun. We climbed in formation, the sound of a dozen massive engines merging into a single growl that seemed to shake the very air around us. Somewhere out there, 20 Japanese Zeros were closing in on our ships. But this time, we weren't the hunted. This time, we were the hunters. A voice crackled in my headset. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. I looked up. At first, just black dots against the morning light. Then a shapes. Wings. Long noses. Sun glinting off canopies. Zeros. Sleek. Deadly. Beautiful in their own way. My stomach tightened. Memories of losing friends to those planes flooded back, but I forced them down. This time we had teeth. The Zeros came in high. A perfect V formation against the rising sun. It was classic Japanese strategy. Force us to climb into their trap, make us bleed energy, then cut us down from above. But Commander Blake wasn't buying it. Hold formation, hold. His voice in my headset was calm, steady. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the roar of the engine. The sun flashed off their wings as they began to roll, peeling down toward us like hawks diving on prey. Brake now. We split wide, our Hellcats banking hard, the G-forces pressing me into my seat. The world tilted. Ocean became sky, sky became ocean. The first burst of gunfire ripped past my canopy, white-hot tracers stitching the air where I had been just seconds before. I rolled hard right, pulling into a climbing turn. The Hellcat's power was intoxicating. I could feel her climbing faster than any Wildcat ever could, my speed not bleeding away as quickly. A Zero flashed past my nose. Instinct screamed to pull the trigger, but he was gone too fast. Over the radio, chaos. 2 on my tail. I've got 1 smoking. Brake left, Blake. Brake left. I caught sight of a Hellcat chasing a Zero in a tight spiral climb. The Japanese pilot was good, rolling, jinking, refusing to give a clean shot. But the Hellcat could follow, and it did. A burst of .50 caliber fire lit the Zero's wing root, pieces of metal and fabric exploding away. The enemy plane wobbled, then spun out, trailing thick black smoke before vanishing into the sea. 1 down, a voice yelled. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero dropped in from above, coming straight at me. I shoved the throttle forward. The Hellcat roared, the nose lifting. The world narrowed to a single point, that oncoming fighter. He opened fire first. Tracers zipped past, some slamming into my left wing with a metallic thunk. I didn't flinch, lined up the sight, squeezed the trigger. The 6 Brownings unleashed a storm. The Hellcat shook with the recoil, the smell of cordite filling the cockpit. I saw my rounds walk across his fuselage. Then his canopy exploded outward. The Zero snapped into a dive, streaming smoke, and slammed into the ocean in a plume of white spray. 2 seconds. That's all it took. More incoming, 3 o'clock. Blake called out. I banked hard right. 2 Zeros, tight together, closing fast. They had the advantage, altitude, position. I didn't run. Instead, I dove. The Hellcat howled as we dropped toward the sea, the wind screaming past my canopy. The Zeros followed, their noses dipping, confident they could run me down. That's when I pulled. A hard, brutal climb, the kind that would bleed a Zero's speed instantly. The Hellcat's big engine hauled me upward like I was on a winch, gravity trying to rip my arms from the stick. The lead Zero stalled first, nose dipping, wings wobbling. I rolled inverted, dropped behind him, and fired. The burst caught him square in the engine. Flames erupted instantly. His wingman broke off, but too late. Blake was on him. 1 short burst, and the second Zero spiraled down. I remember thinking in that moment, we can win this. Not just survive, win. But the fight wasn't over. Far ahead, the Japanese bombers lumbered toward our convoy, still escorted by at least a dozen more Zeros. If they reached the ships, men would die. Blake's voice came through, urgent. All units, push through. Hit those bombers. We reformed in a loose line and dove as one. The bombers grew larger in my gun sight. Big, slow targets, but deadly if they released their payloads. A Zero came screaming in from the side, trying to protect them. I yanked the stick left, our planes passing within feet of each other, the flash of his canopy burning into my memory. He rolled to chase me, but the Hellcat was already climbing again. I pulled into position behind him and let the Brownings speak. The Zero erupted in a flash of flame. The bombers were close now, too close. I lined one up, aimed for the cockpit, and fired. Glass shattered, smoke poured from the engines, and the big bird dropped toward the waves. By the time the fight ended, the sea was littered with wreckage, black smoke rising in pillars, oil slicks glistening in the sun. We had lost men, but far fewer than before. And for the first time in the Pacific War, The Zeros had been beaten back. As we circled back to the Essex, I looked down at the ocean and thought of the friends we'd lost over the years, and how maybe, just maybe, the Hellcat had evened the odds. The Zero's reign was ending, and the hunters had become the hunted. The flight deck of the USS Essex was alive with motion, but different now. The chaos of battle was gone, replaced by the measured urgency of recovery. Yellow shirt deck crews waved us in, guiding battered Hellcats onto the pitching, rolling deck. Some came in with holes in their wings, some trailed smoke, and some never came back at all. I cut my throttle, felt the sudden silence as the prop slowed, and rolled to my parking spot. The smell of burnt oil, cordite, and salt water mixed into the heavy Pacific air. When I climbed out of the cockpit, the reality hit me. 2 Hellcats were missing. 2 pilots, friends gone. And yet, the air group commander's eyes told a different story. This was a victory. A hard-fought, bloody victory, but a turning point nonetheless. We gathered in the ready room. Helmets off, sweat-streaked faces, shirts clinging to our backs. Maps spread out on the table, the positions of enemy sightings marked in red pencil. The intelligence officer walked us through the numbers. Gentlemen, today, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost more than 20 aircraft. We lost 4. The room was silent. Not because of the losses. Losses were a part of war, but because of what those numbers meant. For 2 long years, the Zero had ruled the skies. Its speed, agility, and climb rate had made it the predator, and us, the prey. But now something had changed. The Hellcat had arrived. The F6F wasn't just a new airplane. It was a new philosophy. Bigger engine, thicker armor, self-sealing fuel tanks that didn't turn a single bullet hit into a funeral. It wasn't as nimble in a turn as the Zero, but it didn't need to be. Because for the first time, we had the advantage in climb, dive, and firepower. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. 400 rounds per gun. Enough to shred through not just fighters, but bombers too. And that power came with forgiveness. The Hellcat could take punishment, holes in the wings, oil leaking, control cables frayed, and still bring her pilot home. We had seen it that day. I remember walking the deck later that evening. The sun dipped low over the endless Pacific, painting the clouds in gold and crimson. In the distance, the smoke from the day's battle still lingered, faint trails on the horizon. One of the mechanics was working on a Hellcat riddled with bullet holes. He ran his hand over the jagged edges in the fuselage and shook his head. "This one'll fly again tomorrow," he said, almost to himself. That was the Hellcat's gift, not just to fight, but to endure. History would later call it the Ace Maker. In the months that followed, Hellcat squadrons would rack up kill ratios of 19-1. Names like O'Hare, McCampbell, and Vrashu would become legends. Men who, flying the Hellcat, tore through enemy formations and changed the balance of air power in the Pacific. The Japanese pilots, once feared for their unmatched skill, now found themselves outclimbed, outgunned, and outlasted. They adapted. They had to, but the tide had turned. Every battle after that felt different. We no longer flew with the quiet dread of wondering if we'd come back. We flew with purpose, with the knowledge that we had the tools to win. That night, lying in my bunk, the ship's engines thrumming beneath me, I thought of the day's fight. The roar of the engine, the smell of smoke and oil, the flash of tracers ripping across the sky. And I thought of the men who wouldn't see another sunset. War is victory and loss in the same breath. But above all, I thought of the sound, the deep, unshakable growl of the Hellcat's engine. A sound that told every pilot in the Pacific. The hunters had arrived. And from that day forward, the skies belonged to us. Before the battle, before the roar of engines and the smell of burning fuel, there was a quiet room in Bethpage, Long Island. A row of engineers stood around a chalkboard. Blueprints were pinned to the walls. Lines and curves showed the sleek shape of a fighter that did not yet exist. It was 1941, and America was still watching the war from across the ocean. But the whispers from the Pacific were clear. The Japanese Zero was unmatched. Grumman Aircraft's designers knew that if war came, our boys would need more than courage. They would need an edge. They called it Project G50. A single-seat fighter with an engine so powerful it would lift 12,000 pounds of steel and ammunition into the sky like it was nothing. They would build it bigger than the Zero, heavier than the Zero, but they would make it climb faster, dive harder, and take more hits. Each decision was a gamble. Add armor, the plane gets heavier. Add more guns, it needs more fuel. More fuel, it needs a bigger engine. A bigger engine, more heat, more stress, more noise. But they work through the nights. Test flights, crashes, corrections. And slowly, the shape began to emerge. The shape that would one day be called the F6F Hellcat. Training for it was no easier. I still remember my first day at the training airfield in Florida. The instructor, a tough Marine major with a voice like gravel, stood in front of the lineup of new Hellcats. You treat her right, he barked, and she'll bring you home. Treat her wrong, and you won't need to worry about the enemy. The first time I climbed into the cockpit, I realized this was not like the Wildcats we'd flown before. The seats sat high, giving you a king's view of the world. The wings stretched far out to either side, the edges carrying the weight of 6 Brownings. And that engine, even at idle, it vibrated through your bones. We trained until our hands could find every switch in the dark. We drilled gunnery until our tracers stitched perfect lines across the sky. We practiced dives from 20,000 feet, feeling the speed push us into the seat until our vision blurred. And then came the day when practice turned into reality. It was over the Marshall Islands. The call crackled through the radio. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, zeros inbound. We broke formation, 4 Hellcats rolling into a steep climb. The sunlight flashed across our canopies as we rose to meet them. The zeros came fast, silver and green shapes slicing through the air. They turned hard, trying to bait us into a turning fight, their specialty. But this time, we didn't follow. I shoved the throttle forward. The Hellcats surged ahead. We climbed right past their turn, rolled over the top, and came screaming down. The first burst tore through the lead Zero's fuselage. Flames erupted instantly. Another tried to pull up, but I stayed on him, my tracers walking across his wing until it snapped away. In seconds, the sky was ours. They couldn't match the dive. They couldn't match the climb. And they couldn't take the punishment we could. That fight was short. But the lesson was burned into every pilot there that day. The Hellcat was not just another plane. It was the answer. Later, back on the carrier, I ran into the mechanic who kept my bird in the air. He handed me a jagged piece of metal, a chunk of enemy bullet that had lodged in the armor plate behind my seat. Would have been your spine, he said with a half smile. I just nodded and tucked it into my pocket. I still have it. The war would drag on for 2 more years. There would be more battles, more losses, more victories. But every time the Hellcat's wheels left the deck, we carried with us the confidence that came from flying the best machine the Pacific had ever seen. And in the end, that made all the difference. The year was 1944. The Pacific was no longer quiet. It roared, with engines, with bombs, with the clash of 2 empires. Our carrier group cut across the blue expanse like a moving fortress. Deck crews worked under the brutal sun, loading ammunition belts, checking oil, tightening bolts. The smell of fuel, sweat, and salt water filled the air. We knew the Japanese wouldn't give up their hold on the islands easily. And now, they were sending everything they had left to stop us. At dawn, the call came. Enemy formation sighted, north by northwest. Large number of bogies inbound. Every muscle in my body tightened. This was it. This was the battle we'd been training for. I strapped into my Hellcat, the harness biting into my shoulders. The deck officer gave the signal. The deck crew pulled the chocks, and I pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared like an unleashed beast, and the carrier deck blurred beneath me until it vanished. I was airborne, and I wasn't alone. Dozens of Hellcats rose into the pale morning sky, their wingtips almost touching in perfect formation. Far ahead, we saw them, a dark cloud against the sun. Zeros, dozens of them, sleek, fast, and deadly. For a moment, it felt like 2 storms drifting toward each other across an empty ocean. Silent, inevitable. Then, the sky exploded. Tracer fire cut through the blue. Engines screamed. The sun flashed across spinning propellers and polished wings. The Zeros came at us in a tight swarm, turning sharply, trying to pull us into their trap. It had worked on other planes before. It wasn't going to work on Hellcats. I rolled hard, diving under their formation, feeling the G-force press against my chest. A Zero flashed across my sights. I squeezed the trigger. The 6 Brownings spat fire. Bullets tore through his wing, fuel streaming out before a spark turned it into a fireball. Another Zero tried to get behind me, but I pulled the Hellcat into a steep climb. The engine howled as I climbed higher and higher, the Zero struggling to follow. Then I rolled over, nose down, and came straight at him from above. One short burst, and he was gone. Everywhere I looked, Hellcats were dominating. We could take hits the Zeros couldn't. We could dive faster, climb higher, and fire longer. The Japanese pilots fought with skill and courage, but for the first time, they were on the wrong side of the performance curve. Down below, I caught sight of the ocean and the silhouettes of Japanese carriers. Our orders were clear: take out their air cover, and our bombers would finish the job. We pressed harder. One Hellcat after another scored kills, sending smoking wrecks spiraling into the waves. By midday, the sky was ours. I landed back on the carrier with my hands still shaking from adrenaline. The deck crew was cheering. Word had already spread. We had destroyed hundreds of enemy planes in a single day. The Japanese called it the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. For us, it was proof. Proof that the F6F Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was the turning point of the Pacific Air War. But deep down, I knew the war wasn't over yet. There would be more missions, more dogfights, more close calls. And every time, the Hellcat would carry us into the fire, and, if we were lucky, bring us home. April 1945. The sea around Okinawa boiled with steel. Our invasion fleet stretched across the horizon. Carriers, battleships, destroyers, troop transports. It was the largest armada the Pacific had ever seen. But the Japanese, they weren't going to let us take this island without a fight. Word came from the radar operators first. A blip, then dozens more. An entire swarm of incoming aircraft. They weren't ordinary fighters. They weren't even coming back. These were kamikaze, pilots with one mission: crash into our ships, no matter the cost. I sat in the cockpit of my Hellcat, the engine rumbling under me. The deck crew signaled, the chocks were pulled, and I launched into the sky once again. The air was thick with smoke and salt spray as I climbed toward the incoming threat. Far ahead, the sunlight flashed off wings. Then I saw them. Zeros, dive bombers, all packed with explosives, all diving straight for our ships. The radio crackled. Intercept them before they reach the fleet. Stop every last one of them. I pushed the throttle forward. The Hellcat surged ahead, the propeller a blur, the wind screaming past the canopy. I lined up the lead kamikaze in my sights and fired. My tracers tore through his fuselage. The Zero burst into flames, spiraling into the sea, leaving a black scar across the water. But there were more, too many. They came in waves, diving low, twisting to avoid our fire. One got through, hitting a destroyer off our starboard side. The explosion lit the sky, sending steel and water hundreds of feet into the air. We couldn't let another through. I banked hard, diving after another kamikaze. He saw me coming and swerved, but the Hellcat could outturn him at high speed. I fired again. His wing ripped apart, and he cartwheeled into the waves. Below me, other Hellcats were doing the same, picking off the attackers one by one. The sky was chaos. Fire, smoke trails, the roar of engines. Hours passed like minutes. By sunset, the last of the kamikazes had been driven off or destroyed. The ocean around Okinawa was littered with burning wreckage. We had saved the fleet, but at a cost. Some of our ships still burned. Some of our pilots never came back. That night, as I stood on the carrier deck, the stars reflecting off the dark water, I thought about the men we'd lost, and the enemy pilots too. Young men on both sides, caught in a war bigger than themselves. The Hellcat had carried me through it all. From the Marianas to Okinawa, it had been more than a machine. It had been my lifeline. By the time the war ended, the Hellcat had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any fighter in the Pacific. It was the silent giant of the skies, the guardian of the fleet. And for those of us who flew it, it was the reason we came home at all. August 1945. The war was over. The news came across the radio one humid afternoon as we were preparing for another sortie. Japan had surrendered. The guns had gone silent. For a long moment, nobody moved. We just stood there on the flight deck of the Essex, listening to the crackling voice on the airwaves. Some of the men laughed. Some cried. Others just stared out at the horizon, as if trying to see a future they hadn't dared imagine. For me, it was complicated. I'd spent years in the cockpit, my hands gripping the stick, my eyes scanning the skies for specks that meant life or death. Now, the skies were empty. The ocean was calm, and the enemy was gone. But so were many of my friends. We sailed back to Pearl Harbor, our Hellcats lined up neatly on deck, their paint chipped, their fuselages scarred with bullet holes and salt. They looked tired, but proud, like warriors returning from battle. As we docked, civilians crowded the shore, waving flags, holding signs, cheering until their voices broke. They called us heroes. But I couldn't help thinking of the men who wouldn't be walking down that gangway. In the weeks that followed, the Hellcats were unloaded, cleaned, and in many cases decommissioned. Some would be sold for scrap. Others would sit in hangars, gathering dust, their engines never to roar again. It felt wrong. This machine had been my shield, my sword, my guardian angel. She had been there in every battle, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And now, she would be silent. One evening, I went to the hangar alone. The Hellcat was there, her blue paint dulled, her propeller still. I climbed into the cockpit one last time. The seat was familiar, worn to my shape. The instruments, the throttle, the stick, all exactly as I remembered. I sat there, eyes closed, and for a moment I was back in the clouds. The engine rumbling, the wind screaming past, the enemy dead ahead. I could hear the chatter on the radio, the roar of the Brownings, the adrenaline surging through my veins. But when I opened my eyes, it was just silence, and I knew my war was over. Years later, people would ask me what it was like, flying the Hellcat, facing the Zero, living through those days when the Pacific was a battlefield. I'd tell them this. The Hellcat wasn't the prettiest plane. It wasn't the fastest, or the lightest, or the most graceful. But it was strong. It was loyal. And it never, ever let me down. We called it the Zero Killer. History called it the most successful fighter in Navy history. But to me, it was a friend that carried me home when so many others never made it back. And when I think of the Pacific War, I don't think of flags or medals. I think of the sound of that engine, the feel of that stick in my hand, and the way the sun looked over the ocean when you'd survived another mission. That is what I'll remember.